Hey guys, this is Snap. Today we're going to be talking about all of the party builds for the 320 Calandra expansion. Now I'm going to break my 320 videos up into two different kind of sections where one of them I'm going to be going over, kind of give my general thoughts on where the state of the game is. So we're going to need a little bit of context on all of these builds, and I'm going to have to level with you guys. While I'm going to be releasing these builds, I'm not sure that there is going to be any content for you to be playing with all of these aforementioned builds. Because in reality, in a 6-man or even 4 or 5-man, there's only really 2, maybe 3 choices of content you can do to make profit in current endgame POE. First one being goblin hunting with a heavy focus on Legion and or Abyss. And the second one is going to be boxes farming using the Enraged Sextant and just going for cards. To me, those are really the 2 viable 6-man MFing strategies that you can employ. We don't know how good or bad the new goblins are going to be. They haven't really released any information on how that new conversion system is going to work. But before, the goblin hunting strategy had a heavy reliance on getting some of those Lunaris Solaris touch conversions. And it could be the case that the top end is nerfed and they didn't really replace it with some super satisfying stuff at the low end, so it could just be a straight blanket nerf. We really have no idea how that's going to play out. Regardless, I think like Abyss farming with boxes and just going for enraged stuff, monstrous treasure if you can get it, that kind of stuff is going to be a decent card output, and that's really all you can do. There isn't really much else for you to do here in a 6-man. That being said, let's go over all of the builds and how they've changed in the patch. All right, first things first is of course going to be the carry build. Now, the carry build really wasn't changed with the patch. If you are going for mass clear in a 6-man, just ultimate damage output, of course the best thing is still going to be Vaal Vortex. We thought we would see some changes to maybe Nebulous or the Sextant at this point, but this build is still reigning supreme. But to be honest, this might be a little overkill. This build is only super relevant in the 5-man deli ultimate damage output, and you might get more value playing something like Spark if you're going for like a lower deli value. If you're doing like 40 to 60% deli, this build maybe doesn't have the coverage and the damage output if you're not spawning a bunch of Beyond. You might go for something a little more coverage, and Spark is probably going to be that skill, especially if you're in something like Defiled Cathedral with a bunch of narrow hallways. Now, the carry build, if you're not familiar with how it works, it just has a heavy reliance on its damage through Nebulous. Nebulous giving you a bunch of increased damage per increased resistance, which you're getting from the Aurabot. You're using a Fizz spell, Vaal Vortex, converting 100% of that to lightning using the mastery, and then also the gem. The lightning is also being converted to cold using 2 Call of the Brotherhoods with Catalyst. That's 96% to cold. And then lastly, there's a third conversion step, which is cold to fire. So we are converting 60% of that to fire. And now that we're converting 60% of that to fire, we're gaining fire as extra chaos damage. On top of that, we are gaining a bunch of extra chaos damage with Incandescent Heart. Because we're converting through all of the elements, Incandescent Heart is gaining elemental damage as chaos at each step. And this is why this build is doing so much damage. You can use this concept to scale your damage and use any number of skills. However, Fizz spells and or lightning spells scale the best because you can leverage hatred and or wrath. So Vaal BV is a super good choice with the Sextant. Spark is pretty much the next best choice, and then you get a little bit of crit investment. The reason we go Assassin is because of the free elusive as well as all of the multi, which is sometimes a hard stat to get in party builds. Clusters are going to be Vast Power Magnifier just for a bunch of AoE. Makes your Blade Vortex is a lot bigger. We get Inner Conviction on the tree here because we want to remove Frenzy Charges from the equation, because there is a alter mod that removes global defenses per Frenzy Charge. So if you remove Frenzy Charges from the equation here, we can click the alter mod that gives us minus global defenses per Frenzy Charge, which lets us click more alters. Other than that, the build is pretty straightforward. Nothing's really changed here. Just some more crit on the tree, some ES, some reservation for some personal auras, and then it also has 2 soul rippers for flash charge generation, which gives us more souls for the Vaal Vortex. But one thing that did change here is the Adziri's Reign is no longer a jewel anymore. This is now deleted. The best thing to replace this with would just be a double or triple multi-jewel if you can get it. Jewel like this will work just fine. Looking for double multi and maybe some other useful stat. Here I have Reduced Curses effect on you, so it should be pretty easy to replace that jewel that's been deleted. One of the other most important things for defenses here is the Watcher's Eye. The ES gain discipline mod is so OP on stuff like Vaal Vortex and Spark. You should highly prioritize this for survivability and high-end deli mapping, so make sure you're looking out for that. So if you're going to be going a farming route with either boxes or any amount of Beyond or deli and you have a lot of density, this build is probably going to be the one you want to play. Now, Spark is also going to be a very good option. The builds are going to look pretty identical with maybe some different clusters and a little bit more investment into prod speed instead of area damage. Overall, the builds are going to look pretty much the same. Now, the other farming strategy that people might be doing here in a party is going to be Legion Blasting. Now, Legion Blasting in 319 was pretty profitable in that you were hunting basically goblins per hour, because 90% of the money you were making in 6-man mapping endgame was just churning out as many rare monsters as possible every hour, finding the goblin that was going to drop you like 30, 40 plus divine, and then culling it with as much rarity as possible. So we set out to make a carry build that could basically just be one-shotting legions in a 6-man party with as much deli as possible. Now, you're going to run into a wall where it's almost impossible to get a high enough average hit on a single spell cast to one-shot legions that are above like 60% deli. And this is basically the build that we came up with. First things first is the skill choice here is Vaal Arc. You kind of have two choices for one-shotting legions here, and it's going to be Vaal Arc or Vaal Ice Nova. Problem with Vaal Ice Nova immediately is that it's not a lightning skill, which means it can't benefit from Wrath or half of Nebulous. Vaal Arc has a pretty similar amount of coverage and has a lot more scaling to it because it's a lightning spell, so it's pretty much the obvious choice here. The other thing you might notice immediately, this is an Inquisitor, and the reason for that is because your penetration is obviously super dependent on the Cursebot, and it is impossible for the Cursebot to get equal coverage on all sides of the Legion, and so relying on the Cursebot as your source of penetration is typically a bad idea if your goal is to be one-shotting legions. And so the best ascendancy choice here is going to be Inquisitor for your inevitable judgment, obviously. Now, there's a couple things to mention here about Vaal Arc mechanically that explain some of the build choices we made here. Vaal Arc and Vaal Ice Nova are similar mechanically in that the hit for the entirety of the skill is calculated based off of just a single hit. What I mean by that is you cast the skill once, and if the skill has crit, then the entire skill is critting post chain, and on Vaal Ice Nova, every single time it creates an additional wave. So even though you're spawning like 100, waves, or, you're chaining hundreds of times, either the skill is critting or the skill is doing double damage throughout the entire cast, or it's not. So it's really imperative that you get your crit chance basically to near 100%, if not already at 100%. And then additionally, you want to try and get your sources of double damage from the Sabo support, as well as on cluster jewels from pressure point to near 100%, so you have that consistency on the one-shots on the Legion. The gearing here for this character is going to be very similar to what you find on other carries for 6-man parties. The staples here of Nebulous, Incandescent Heart, Double Call of the Brotherhoods. I have a Mage Blood on here, but if you don't have a Mage Blood, just replace it with a rare belt with some res. This is probably going to be the slot where you're just capping out your res. Now, the clusters here are important. We want to get as much crit strike chance and as well as double damage from pressure points as we can. Quick Getaway is also a super good source of crit chance. It's probably the best thing to pair with pressure points. Alternatively, the other thing you can get here is Crit Multi. Technically, if the minor support is giving you a 100% chance to deal double damage on that first hit, it will proliferate to the rest of the Legion. But this can give you a little bit of consistency on the Legion if perhaps he doesn't have all of his mines out. You're consistently putting out all the mines on the first target and getting your double damage proc. You can definitely drop the pressure points and just go crit multi-mediums instead. The other thing to note here is we are going Inner Conviction once again. The reason for that is because you can get Inner Conviction to remove your power charges and then get them back by using Ralakesh's Impatience. Ralakesh, when you stand still, completely bypasses the downside of Inner Conviction, and it allows you to get both power and frenzy charges in combination with Badge of the Brotherhood. So this will give you a ton more damage. The reason this is so powerful is because you're getting more damage from Inner Conviction as well as the more damage for all of your frenzy charges. And you can absolutely prep in the middle of the Legion, stand still, get all of your charges, and unleash it on the entire Legion. The other consideration here is that this build is currently CI, but it doesn't need to be. You can absolutely turn this into a life-based build and go Pain Attunement. You just throw on Pet Blood, and you're basically good to go. This isn't totally necessary depending on how your gearing is, and especially how powerful your Aurabot is. You're already one-shotting the Legion, and you don't need the Pain Attunement damage, then just go CI. It makes you a little bit safer. Otherwise, totally go Pain Attunement, get that extra Pet Blood, and you'll be doing a ton more damage, and it makes your Legion one-shots more consistent. The other important thing to note here on this build is you need to get an impossible escape on Acrobatics for the additional chaining range down here. It also gives you a little bit of crit multi. It's a super good spot, something to look out for. So basically with this build, you just run up to the Legion, have somebody activate it for you, throw down all of your mines to get the double damage from the minor support. You press the Vaal Arc twice, and if you've done everything correctly, you're hopefully one-shotting the Legions. One thing that you might want to do that we've been experimenting around with is sending one person to each side of the Legion, like one person go left, one person go right, and that kind of like activates the mobs. I don't know why this happens, but we find that one-shotting the Legion with this skill is more consistent if you've kind of like woken the mobs, so to speak. I think there's something going on with like the mobs aren't activated or active on the server, and so they're not being chained to with the Vaal Arc. But if you simply have somebody walk to each side of the Legion to wake up the mobs, for some reason the chaining is more consistent. And then we've also tried to stick to like 2, maybe 3 orbs of deli on this if you're just churning through Legion. The deli isn't going to be super lucrative for you on scaling the Arch Nemesis Goblin rewards anyways, And so just being able to churn through more legions per hour at like 60% deli is going to probably be better for you in the long run. Yeah, the whole goal of this build is just to walk up to the legion, get up all of your buffs, one-shot it with Vaal arc, collect your loot from the legion, hopefully you've spawned a goblin, and then you leave and go next map. Now, this build could be completely irrelevant. If the goblins are shit, not rewarding, this build is fucking worthless, but if you want to go for a legion angle with a carry, this is definitely something I would look into. Now we're moving on to the Aurabot. Once again, there's two versions here. One that's kind of like early game, where you're going to be able to do like 40, 60% deli and feel really comfortable. The other one is going to be a higher investment version that gets you to like 89, 90 overcap. To be honest, I don't know if the 90 overcap version is super necessary. I'm not even sure that 100% deli is even worth doing anymore. I'm going to include that version there anyways in case you want to do it. There is fortunately not really any changes here to the Aurabot. Of course, the Conqueror's efficiency and potency have gotten removed. This affects us in two ways. Obviously, the Conqueror's efficiency has removed some efficiency from our tree, but they've added it back as a rare jewel. So it's super easy just to replace our jewel with one of these. You can corrupt it, just a one mod, but it does let you level up your vitality a little bit if you do get them. So that's one option. And then because they've removed 3% aura effect from the Conqueror's potency, it makes hitting breakpoints a lot more tricky. However, they did add back 5 aura effect to the Jinx Juju. This is now giving you 15 aura effect. So we lost 3 and gained 5. So if you're using Juju instead of Ashes of the Stars, you are going to be getting all of those breakpoints back just by equipping Jinx Juju. Other than that, this build is identical to last league. Early on, I think Prism Guardian is the play. You can go Victarios. They are very similar. It's just that for me, I like to put on a Prism Guardian and start making my chest. And then once I have the 25% effect chest, I can then Awakener Orbit onto whichever endgame chest I'm going for. I think my endgame Aurabot wants to be wearing a Regalia and not a Victario's. And so while this build might not be as super efficient as a Victario's version early on, you can kind of like build into your endgame chest. And so that's the reason I do this. There's one other thing to talk about, which is going to be Vaal Smite here was introduced. Now, obviously we don't know numbers on the Smite, but for me, the obvious angle here is to put it inside of your Vaal Caress. It'll give you +5 levels on the Smite. There are a couple questions, however. We don't know that the buff from Vaal Smite and regular Smite will stack. If they do stack, you obviously use them side by side on each other. You want to have a Vaal Smite in the gloves to get the +5, and then maybe you want to have a second Phantasmal Smite in a separate gem setup so that you can get the buffs of both. Now, if they don't stack, you're probably going to make the hard choice between getting Phantasmal Smite or Vaal Smite, and that's purely a numbers game. Because if the buffs don't stack, you are going to need to choose between the attack and cast speed that Phantasmal Smite gives you versus the extra lightning damage that Vaal Smite gives you. And to be honest, the lightning damage on the Vaal Smite has to be really substantial to outweigh the Phantasmal Smite attack and cast speed bonus that it gives. So it could be that this Vaal Smite isn't super usable on Aurabot because you're going to have to choose between Phantasmal Smite and the Vaal Smite buff. But if they stack, I would say maybe go for 2 Smite setups, one in your Vaal Caress, because it might be hard to get a Vaal Phantasmal Smite. If you get a Vaal Phantasmal Smite, you can obviously use both in the same gem setup here. That might be looking to be a little bit expensive, if you know what I mean. And then on the endgame version, we're going to be looking at a few changes here as well. Basically, your endgame version is going to want to put on a Matua Tapuna with a +1 Scepter and an Ashes of the Stars, of course. Ashes and the Scepter being super necessary so that we can get our Purity auras to level 23. Our Purity is at level 23, gives us another breakpoint on the max res, which is basically the only thing we care about. Unfortunately, with Lake of Kalandra not going core, we aren't going to be able to get those really crazy 24% life reservation rings. And so I really think the best thing to do on a budget in League is to go back to Skyforths. You still have the Sextant. You're going to be able to use all of your Vaal disciplines in conjunction with your party members to have all the sustain you'd ever need. So putting on Skyforest to make your build a little bit cheaper is obviously a no-brainer for me. If you're doing content like invitations or you're running maps that can't use the Vaal lockout sextant, then you probably obviously don't want to use Skyforths. But if you're using the Sextant, no brainer for me, just slap on the Skyforce. That's what I'm going to be personally doing. Unfortunately, because Conqueror's potency was removed, you do need to divine your chest to a perfect 30% in order to hit the 89 breakpoint. Other than that, this build isn't super changed. You are putting in 2 of the new RMR jewels here. There's nothing crazy on this build. This is probably going to run you like 20 to 40 divines, depending on the price that you get your ashes at. And then also, we don't know how expensive Unnatural Instinct is going to be. So those are a couple question marks with this build. But other than that, it's not super different than what it was last patch. There is one last angle here you can take for an Aurabot, and I want to shout out Waxseed. He sent this POB in my Twitch chat. I modified it a little bit to make it cheaper, but basically the angle is that you go up here and you grab this Elegant Hubris either in this socket. You can also put it in this socket here if you want to, and you basically just need 3 notables, but then you travel all the way down to Champion of the Cause down here, and because you take Champion of the Cause manually, you're pathing to it, you have a lot more leniency on getting aura effect on on your gear. And this build puts everything in a victario's. It has some pretty respectable numbers for Aurabot. It's also not too expensive. It just does have a reliance on the elegant hubris. You do need a 3 notable elegant hubris either in this socket or this socket here. You can put it in the Templar socket, but you are going to be deleting a good amount of your ES. You also are probably going to be losing a breakpoint from the devotion cluster, so not a super great idea if you get in the Templar socket. You do have the jewel that has 3 notables. You can definitely path all the way around, but both of these builds are going to be in a similar ballpark of investment in the 20 to 30 divine range to be able to get to 89 or 90 overcap. Moving on to the curses. Now, these are the big changes that happened this patch, right? The manifesto. So basically, notables on cluster jewels are gone. On the helmet, the Ichor and the enchant are both nerfed. Replica Doedres is deleted. Doedres had a huge penalty applied to it because it's linked to blasphemy now. And then also blasphemy got a huge less multiplier on it. So after looking at all the changes on the patch notes and tinkering around with the numbers a little bit, this is the setup we've landed on. Now, first things first, Cursebot is still absolutely the best thing to slot as the third-party member if you want. It's still insanely powerful. GGG is correct in saying that the curse penalty being removed is going to be huge for cursing bosses and stuff in your map like Kosis, as well as any bosses that spawn. Rare mobs also don't have the penalty applied to them. And with Enfeeble and Temp Chains getting buffed on their base value, while you are going to be cursing at a lesser amount, the nerfs don't seem as substantial as they seem at a first glance. So the passive tree in POB is not updated here. So in my video, I haven't been allocating the passive nodes that are on the tree. However, I'll release an updated POB and edit the description of the video whenever I do get that updated POB out. So first things first is fortunately the cluster jewels with the 2% effect are still in the game, which means that you can still do something similar as you did before, which was getting large with Vendor and Defender and just getting 2% curse effect clusters. It's still probably going to be one of the best ways to get your curse effect on the tree. Now, a lot of the core items here are going to be very similar. It's Series Reflection still giving you that 19% curse effect. You still are going to be able to get an Ichor plus an enchant, albeit at a lesser value on the helmet. Diala's is still going to be best in slot, and I'll explain a little bit why after we go through the rest of the gear. Vixens for an extra curse, Windstreak for an extra curse, Star of Ray class for the AoE, and since Replica Doedre's Damning received such a big nerf, I don't think it's worth putting on anymore. The reason why is because you can get 2 extra curses here on the rings and then also apply a mark and punishment. Punishment is now usable on a Cursebot without stealing kills because they moved the 10% overkill node onto an alt quality instead of on the base gem itself, which means that now we can get an extra curse and apply an extra damage curse that we didn't have before, which is punishment. So this build right here is level 88, and I'm reserving 12 points here to take some of the curse nodes that are up here. And also there's another curse node or curse cluster right here, basically. So you should have enough points to take both of them. I took a look on POE Planner for the new passive tree curse effect, and we are going to be getting 25% from the tree that is currently not in this version of the passive tree. So I have the 25% increase effect on my curses written in here. I also have 18% reduced curse effect on the modifiers here because these cluster jewels are at 3%, and I have 18 total nodes. So I subtracted 18 curse effect. And then also I have Enfeeble and Temp Chains in a Blasphemy setup. And because that's not applied to the gem yet, I just wrote it here in the modifiers just to simulate the amount of curse effect we can get. So with all of that, we do have an Enfeeble that's sitting at a 1.85 multiplier on Blasphemy. And the Temp Chains is sitting at a little bit below, which is 1.61. Now you could go higher on the Temp Chains if you wanted to and go 1.85 on the Temp Chains. But I think the Enfeeble gives you a little bit more value. So I think you want to get the curse effect of the Enfeeble on your helmet. Now, while this multiplier might not seem very high, because the values of Enfeeble were buffed and you're not cursing at a penalty, you're actually going to be making up a decent chunk of that curse effect that you lost. The reason why is because you're putting Enfeeble and Temp Chains in the Dialas and scaling levels instead of quality now. Because they've normalized the level scaling on all of the curses, you're actually going to be getting a lot more bang for your buck when you level up your curses to like level 30 or even 32. So they added +2 gem levels to curses on the passive tree, on top of getting +3 in a Diala's as well as an Empower. You can easily get your Enfeeble to level 30, and I think I expect the gem scaling post 20 to be a lot more favorable than it was before. So you're going to be getting a good amount of curse effect, less damage multipliers from the Enfeeble and the action speed on the Temp Chains. So the levels matter a lot more. This is why Diala's is still a very good choice because it is probably the easiest way for the Cursebot to scale a bunch of levels. So you're going to have a higher base curse but a lower multiplier. So you're going to be bridging the gap a little bit, but it is still very much a nerf. I had to guess it's maybe like a 20 to 30% nerf of total power on the Cursebot, which is completely fine. It's still going to be extremely powerful. It's still going to provide a lot of defenses. It's going to have a lot of penetration on it. Speaking of the pen, this is what it looks like. It's going to have 97% cold. It's going to have maybe like 160% on fire. And then also it's going to have like 70 to 80% on the chaos. There's still a shit ton of pen. Additionally, we are going to be able to cast punishment now because punishment no longer has the 10% overkill explode damage. It's now on an alt quality. So we're going to be getting an extremely good offensive curse that we weren't able to use before while MFing. Now, the curse setup has changed a little bit because we are no longer casting any of our offensive curses on Blasphemy. The setup for this uses Vixens. Now, we're going to be applying all the offensive curses with Vixens, and basically it's a self-casting setup, unfortunately. That being said, it's probably the best way to apply them at the moment, barring some new creative Arcanist brand setup. But I still think Vixens is probably going to be the easiest way to get it online, and it's probably going to just be the easiest thing to stick on. The way it works is you cast a curse spell, and then you can have a 4-link with 4 curses inside of the Vixens, and then it casts 4 additional curses whenever you cast that one curse. So this allows you to apply up to 5 curses with 1 cast. You essentially use 1 curse not inside of the links, and it will trigger all 4 of the curse spells that are inside of the gloves. And you can look at the AoE of this. We are sitting at a 73 AoE on our curses inside of the Dialas, which is just massive. We're casting an elemental weakness inside of the Dialas, which is getting a bunch of levels. I've down leveled it to simulate the nerfs, and then it will basically cast a 4-link with all of the other curses in the gloves, which is punishment, flammability, frostbite, despair. You're running around with your defensive curses on all the time. 5 offensive curses you're casting out of the Vixens, and that's probably going to be the best way to do it. Because you're no longer reserving a bunch of stuff on Blasphemy, you do have some extra RMR left over, so you can easily jam in a Determination and Defiance banner. You can also try to jam in your own Discipline, and there's definitely ways to do that, especially if you drop the Defiance. There's one unfortunate thing here, and that is the Cursebot can no longer really equip Southbounds because the gloves are such a useful tool now to apply the curses. You are probably going to need to rotate Vaal Cyclone onto somebody else if you want to use it at all. Anyways, we're moving on from the Cursebot. Next couple builds here had absolutely 0 changes to them. The Mana Guardian, the Roa character, the Cole character, and then also the Mind Support. One thing to note here is that a couple of these builds lost Conqueror's potency, but you simply just replace them with a rarity jewel on the culler. One other thing to note on the Mind Support is that maybe Kingmaker is not super available. We have no idea what the fuck they did to this item, so if he's unable to put on the Kingmaker, then you can easily just put on some other item like of Dying Breath or even 2 Ephemeral Edges if you want some more personal tankiness. Last but not least is going to be the duo builds that I'd suggest. Now, you have a couple choices here. The bottom line is that Spark is probably going to be your absolute best skill choice. The gearing and characters of all of these are going to look very similar regardless of ascendancy. You're going to have 2 Nebuluses on, 2 Call of the Brotherhoods. It's just you do have some leeway with your ascendancy choice here. You're not necessarily pigeonholed into going anything. You just kind of need to choose something on the top side of the tree. Elementalist is probably the strongest. Witch Ascendancy. On Shadow, you can absolutely pull off either a Trickster or an Assassin. And there are absolutely arguments for going Inquisitor with all of its regen and obviously Inevitable Judgment, so you don't have to worry about pen. All of these choices are super viable, and you might want to ask yourself what you'd rather be league starting with early on in the campaign and in early maps before you transition to a party build, and that might affect what you're playing in the end game. One thing to note here is if you are going Inquisitor for the Inevitable Judgment, you are obviously not going to need an Abhorrent Interrogation. If you are playing the other Ascendancies on Witch or Shadow, Abhorrent Interrogation is honestly a really insane pair of gloves. On all these builds as well, you can look into going Pain Attunement with Pet Blood. It makes the most sense on Inquisitor because you get a bunch of the regen. Still really good even though it was recently nerfed. But other than that, you can basically choose anything on the top side of the tree. For the Aurabot, once again, not much has changed here. One of the main differences here you're going to just be using on the duo Aura support here is that you're going to want to take the Dreamer cluster with the reduced mana cost here, because most likely in a duo you aren't going to be able to rely on the Vaal Lockout Sextant to be able to cast your Blessing. The other way to get your Blessing online is to get some reduced mana cost on the tree here in conjunction with a Flask with the reduced mana cost craft, as well as a inspiration, either divergent or normal, and that will get your mana cost to 0 on the blessing. Once again, you also have a little bit of socket freedom here to include one utility mine setup. You can choose to go Stormblast Mine or the high impact portal. The high impact portal has a little bit more setup. It feels worse to throw while you're mapping, but if you can set them up on like an invitation, the high impact portal mines can sometimes be a little bit higher damage than the Stormblast Mine, although I do know a lot of people prefer the Stormblast Mine setup because it's easier to throw and replace them. Either way, you are going to want a mine setup on your Aurabot, extra damage that's basically completely free. You can absolutely do the Victario's version of the Aurabot that comes down to Champion of the Cause. It's just that once again, you are going to want to take the Dreamer Wheel here in conjunction with the Flask so that you can cast all of your blessings for free. Yeah, that about does it for the builds this time around for the 320 expansion. I'm going to do a separate video that more broadly outlines all of our group's thoughts on the 320 expansion and maybe some of our plans going into the 320 expansion. There's a lot of uncertainty right now. This should go over kind of all of the builds and all of the choices that you have access to if you're playing a party of any number of people. TLDR is that Cursebot was nerfed, but not by a substantial margin, and basically every other build received 0 balance changes whatsoever. But to us, kind of a boring patch, not much change, not much new introduced as well. But yeah, if you guys have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I'll be happy to answer as many people as I can. And once again, I'm Snap, and thanks for watching.